The Chrysalid, Chapter 2. I reached home by my usual method. At a point where the woods had lapped up the side of the bank and grown across it, I scrambled down onto a narrow, little-used track. From there on, I was watchful and kept my hands on my knife. I was supposed to keep out of the woods, for it did occasionally, though very rarely, happen that large creatures penetrated as far into the civilized parts as Waknuk, and there was just a chance that one might encounter some kind of wild dog or cat. However, and as usual, the only creatures I heard were small ones, hurriedly making off. After a mile or so, I reached cultivated land with the house in sight, across 3 or 4 fields. I worked along the fringe of the woods, observing carefully from cover, then crossed all but the last field in the shadows of the hedges, and paused to prospect again. There was no one in sight but old Jacob slowly shoveling muck in the yard. When his back was safely turned, I cut swiftly across the bit of open ground, climbed in through a window, and made my way cautiously to my own room. Our house is not easy to describe. Since my grandfather, Elias Storm, built the first part of it over 50 years earlier, it had grown new rooms and extensions at various times. By now it rambled off on one side into stock sheds, stores, stables, and barns, and on the other into wash houses, dairies, cheese rooms, farm hands' rooms, and so on, until it three-quarters enclosed a large beaten earth yard, which lay to leeward of the main house and had a midden for its central feature. Like all houses of the district, it was constructed on a frame of solid, roughly dressed timbers. But since it was the oldest house there, most of the spaces in the outer walls had been filled in with bricks and stones from the ruins of some of the old people's buildings, and plastered wattle was used only for the internal walls. My grandfather, in the aspect he wore when presented to me by my father, appeared to have been a man of somewhat tedious, unrelieved virtue. It was only later that I pieced together a portrait that was more credible, if less creditable. Elias Stronum came from the east, somewhere near the sea. Why he came is not quite clear. He himself maintained that it was the ungodly ways of the east which drove him to search for a less sophisticated, stauncher-minded region, though I have heard it suggested that there came a point when his native parts refused to tolerate him any longer. Whatever the cause, it persuaded him to Waknuk, then undeveloped, almost frontier country, with all his worldly goods in a train of 6 wagons at the age of 45. He was a husky man, a dominating man, and a man fierce for rectitude. He had eyes that could flash with evangelical fire beneath bushy brows. Respect for God was frequently on his lips, and the fear of the devil constantly in his heart, and it seems to have been hard to say which inspired him the more. Soon after he had started the house, he went off on a journey and brought back a bride. She was shy, pretty in the pink and golden way, and 25 years younger than himself. She moved, I have been told, like a lovely colt when she thought herself unwatched, as timorously as a rabbit when she felt her husband's eye upon her. All her answers, poor thing, were dusty. She did not find that a marriage service generated love. She did not enable her husband to recapture his youth through hers, nor could she compensate for that by running his home in the manner of an experienced housekeeper. Elias was not a man to let shortcomings pass unremarked. In a few seasons he had straightened the coltishness with admonitions, faded the pink and gold with preaching, and produced a sad, gray wrath of a wifehood who died unprotesting a year after her second son was born. Grandfather Elias had never had a moment's doubt of the proper pattern for his heir. My father's faith was bred into his bones. His principles were his sinews, and both responded to a mind richly stored with examples from the Bible and from Nicholson's Repentances. In faith, father and son were at one. The difference between them was only in approach. The evangelical flash did not appear in my father's eye. His virtue was more legalistic. Joseph Stronum, my father, did not marry until Elias was dead, and when he did, he was not a man to repeat his father's mistake. My mother's views harmonized with his own. She had a strong sense of duty and never doubted where it lay. Our district, and consequently our house, as the first there, was called Waknuk because of a tradition that there had been a place of that name there or thereabouts long, long ago in the time of the old people. The tradition was, as usual, vague, but certainly there had been some buildings of some kind, for the remnants and foundations had remained until they were taken for the new buildings. There was also the long bank, running away until it reached the hills, and the huge scar that must have been made by the old people when, in their superhuman fashion, had cut away half a mountain in order to find something or other that interested them. The place may have been called Waknuk then. Anyway, Waknuk it had become an orderly, law-abiding, God-respecting community of some 100 scattered holdings, large and small. My father was a man of local consequence. When, at the age of 16, he had made his first public appearance by giving a Sunday address in the church his father had built, there had still been fewer than 60 families in the district. But as more land was cleared for farming and more people came to settle, he was not submerged by them. He was still the largest landowner. He still continued to preach frequently on Sundays and to explain with practical clarity the laws and views held in heaven upon a variety of matters and practices, and upon the appointed days he administered the laws, temporal, as a magistrate. For the rest of the time he saw to it that he, and all within his control, continued to set a high example to the district. Within the house, life centered, as was the local custom, upon the large living room, which was also the kitchen. As the house was the largest and best in Waknuk, so was the room. The great fireplace there was an object of pride, not vain pride, of course, more being a matter of conscience of having given the worthy treatment to the excellent materials that the Lord had provided. A kind of testament, really. The hearth was solid stone blocks. The whole chimney was built of bricks and had never been known to catch fire. The area about its point of emergence was covered with the only tiles in the district, so that the thatch which covered the rest of the roof had never caught fire either. My mother saw to it that the big room was kept very clean and tidy. The floor was composed of pieces of brick and stone and artificial stone cleverly fit together. The furniture was whitely scrubbed tables and stools, with a few chairs. The walls were whitewashed. Several burnished pans, too big to go in the cupboards, hung against them. The nearest approach to decoration was a number of wooden panels with sayings, mostly from repentances, artistically burned into them. The one on the left of the fireplace read, "Only the image of God is man." The one on the right, "Keep pure the stock of the Lord." On the opposite wall, two more said, "Blessed is the norm," and "In purity our salvation." The largest was the one on the back wall, hung to face the door which led to the yard. It reminded everyone who came in, "Watch thou for the mutant." Frequent references to these texts had made me familiar with the words long before I was able to read. In fact, I'm not sure that they did not give me my first reading lessons. I knew them by heart, just as I knew others elsewhere in the house which said things like, "The norm is the will of God," and "Reproduction is the only holy production," and "The devil is the father of deviation," and a number of others about offenses and blasphemies. Most of them were still obscure to me. Others I had learned something about. Offenses, for instance. That was because the occurrence of an offense was sometimes quite an impressive occasion. Usually the first sign that one had happened was that my father came into the house in a bad temper. Then in the evening he would call us all together, including everyone who worked on the farm. We would all kneel while he proclaimed our repentance and led prayers for forgiveness. The next morning we would all be up before daylight and gather in the yard. As the sun rose, we would sing a hymn while my father ceremoniously slaughtered the two-headed calf, four-legged chicken, or what other kind of offense it happened to be. Sometimes it would be a much queerer thing than that. Nor were the offenses limited to the livestock. Sometimes there would be some stalks of corn or some vegetables that my father produced and cast on the kitchen table in anger and shame. If it were merely a matter of a few rolls of vegetables, they just came out and were destroyed. But if a whole field had gone wrong, we would wait for good weather and then set fire to it, singing hymns while it burnt. I used to find that a very fine sight. It was because my father was a very careful and pious man with a keen eye for an offense that we used to have more slaughterings and burnings than anyone else. But any suggestion that we were more afflicted with offenses than other people hurt and angered him. He had no wish at all to throw good money away, he pointed out. If our neighbors were as conscientious as ourselves, he had no doubt that their liquidations would far outnumber ours. Unfortunately, there were certain persons with elastic principles. So I learned quite early to know what offenses were. They were things that did not look right, that is to say, did not look like their parents or parent plants. Usually there was only one small thing wrong, but however much or little was wrong, it was an offense. And if it happened among people, it was a blasphemy. At least that was the technical term, though commonly both kinds were called deviations. Nevertheless, the question of offenses was not always as simple as one might think. And when there was disagreement, the district's inspector could be sent for. My father, however, seldom called in the inspector. He preferred to be on the safe side and liquidate anything doubtful. There were people who disapproved of his meticulousness, saying that the local deviation rate, which had shown a steady overall improvement and now stood at half of what it had been in my grandfather's time, would have been better still but for my father. All the same, the Waknuk district had a great name for purity. Ours was no longer a frontier region. Hard work and sacrifice had produced a stability of stock and crops which could be envied even by some communities to the east of us. You could now go some 30 miles to the south or southwest before you came to wild country. That is to say, parts where the chance of breeding true was less than 50%. After that, everything grew more erratic across a belt which was 10 miles wide in some places and up to 20 in others until you came to the mysterious fringes where nothing was dependable, and where, to quote my father, the devil struts his wide estates, and the laws of God are mocked. Fringes country, too, was said to be variable in depth, and beyond it lay the Badlands, about which nobody knew anything. Usually anybody who went into the Badlands died there, and the one or two men who had come back from them did not last long. It was not the Badlands, but the fringes that gave us trouble from time to time. The people of the fringes, at least one calls them people because although they were really deviations, they often looked quite like ordinary human people, if nothing had gone too much wrong with them. These people then had very little where they lived in their border country, so they came out into the civilized parts to steal grain and livestock and clothes and tools and weapons, if they could, and sometimes they carried off children. Occasional small raids used to happen 2 or 3 times a year, and nobody took much notice of them as a rule, except the people who got raided, of course. Usually they had time to get away and lost only their stock. Then everybody would contribute a little in kind or in money to help them set up again. But as time went on and the frontier was pushed back, there were more fringes people trying to live on less country. Some years they got very hungry, and after a time it was no longer just a matter of a dozen or so making a quick raid and then running back into fringes country. They came instead in large organized bands and did a lot of damage. In my father's childhood, mothers used to quiet and awe their troublesome infants by threatening, "Be good now, or I'll fetch old Maggie from the fringes to you. She's got 4 eyes to watch you with, and 4 ears to hear you with, and 4 arms to smack you with. So you be careful." Or, Harry Jack was another ominous figure who might be called in, and he'll take you off to his cave in the fringes where all his family lives. They're all hairy, too, with long tails, and they eat a little boy each for breakfast every morning and a little girl each for supper every night. Nowadays, however, it was not only small children who lived in nervous awareness of the fringes people not so far away. Their existence had become a dangerous nuisance, and their depredations the cause of many representations to the government in Rigo. For all the good the petitions did, they might never have been sent. Indeed, with no one able to tell over a stretch of 500 or 600 miles where the next attack would come, it is difficult to see what practical help could have been given. What the government did do from its comfortable situation far, far to the east was to express sympathy in encouraging phrases and suggest the formation of a local militia, a suggestion which, as all able-bodied males had as a matter of course been members of a kind of unofficial militia since frontier days, was felt to amount to disregard of the situation. As far as the Waknak district was concerned, the threat from the fringes was more of a nuisance than a menace. The deepest raid had come no nearer than 10 miles, but every now and then there were emergencies, and seemingly more every year, which called the men away and brought all the farm work to a stop. The interruptions were expensive and wasteful. Moreover, they always brought anxiety if the trouble was near our sector. Nobody could be sure that they might not come further one time. Mostly, however, we led a comfortable, settled, industrious existence. Our household was extensive. There were my father and mother, my 2 sisters, and my uncle Axel to make the family. But there were also the kitchen girls and dairy maids, some of whom were married to the farm men and their children, and of course the men themselves. So when we were all gathered for the meal at the end of the day's work, there were over 20 of us. And when we assembled for prayers, there were still more because the men from the adjoining cottages came in with their wives and children. Uncle Axel was not a real relative. He had married one of my mother's sisters, Elizabeth. He was a sailor then, and she had gone east with him and died in Rigo when he was on the voyage that had left him a cripple. He was a useful all-round man, though slow in getting around because of his leg, so my father let him live with us. He was also my best friend. My mother came from a family of 5 girls and 2 boys. 4 of the girls were full sisters. The youngest girl and the 2 boys were half-sister and half-brothers to the rest. Hannah, the eldest, had been sent away by her husband, and nobody had heard of her since. Emily, my mother, was next in age. Then there came Harriet, who was married to a man with a big farm at Kentuck, almost 15 miles away. Then Elizabeth, who had married Uncle Axel. Where my half-aunt Lillian and my half-uncle Thomas were, I did not know, but my half-uncle Angus Morton owned the farm next to us, and a mile or more of our boundaries ran together, which annoyed my father, who could scarcely agree with our half-uncle Angus about anything. His daughter, Rosalind, was of course my cousin. Although Waknak was itself the biggest farm in the district, most of them were organized along the same lines, and all of them growing larger. For with the improving stability rate, there was incentive to extend. Every year, felling of trees and clearing went on to make new fields. The woods and spurs of forest were being nibbled away until the countryside was beginning to look like the old, long-cultivated land in the east. It was said nowadays even people in Rigo knew where Waknak was without looking it up on a map. I lived, in fact, on the most prosperous farm in a prospering district. At the age of 10, however, I had little appreciation of that. My impression was of an uncomfortably industrious place where there always seemed to be more jobs than people, unless one was careful, so on this particular evening I contrived to lie low until routine sounds told me that it was near enough to the mealtime for me to show myself safely. I hung about watching the horses being unharnessed and turned out. Presently the bell on the gable end tolled a couple of times. Doors opened and people came into the yard making for the kitchen. I went along with them. The warning, "Watch thou for the mutant," faced me as I went in, but it was much too familiar to stir a thought. What interested me exclusively at the moment was the smell of food.